good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever it is that you are listening to this podcast. This is the Kenny Climate Dialogues. Welcome. This is the podcast at the intersection of international education and climate action. I'm CJ Tremblay, and today's a very exciting day. I'm really glad you're listening. I am a huge fan of our guest today. I'm a huge fan of our Kenny co-host. And quite frankly, I'm a fan of the work that all of them do. We are going to be joined by a couple of team members from the Canadian Bureau for International Education, as well as from the Inter-America Organization for Higher Education. The CBIE has an annual conference, and the OIHE puts on the Conference of the Americas for International Education, sometimes referred to as CAIE or CAIE, and that happens every 2 years. So the OIHE is a regional association, spans the Americas. They're organizers of the CAIE conference. It's a really interesting model, with the frequency being every other year, with their most recent conference being in Colombia in October 2019. The Canadian Bureau for International Education, as the name suggests, focuses specifically on Canada. They have an annual conference, and it was recently fully digital in November. I went, it was a great time. Now, I've been to both of their conferences in person and now virtually with the CBIE, and I've done so as a service provider, as an active participant, as a speaker, and these conferences have a tremendous impact. They've had a tremendous impact on my life, my personal career trajectory. So this is a personal conversation today. It's complex. And I think a lot of people listening who love going to conferences will find this relatable because there's really interesting stuff to talk about. So thank you for listening. Buckle up. This is going to be a wonderful episode. Of note is that actually, the CAIE and the CBIE were the last two conferences I attended before everything changed. Now, as far as conferences goes, they are a huge, tremendous driver of collaboration. We know how important collaboration is in our sector. We know how important partnerships are. They're also a really big driver of emissions. So we're going to explore that a little bit. Now, partnerships for the goal, which is the UN Sustainable Development Goal number 17, is a critical one. And yet, flying to attend these conferences is just the reality. And as you know, flying is the most carbon intensive thing we can do as humans, pretty much kind of up there, the worst thing we can do. But partnerships are also so important. So how do we balance those things? Now, I should confess, I love conferences. I love conferences so much. I have built tremendous relationships at conferences, tremendous professional partnerships at conferences. And recently I found myself asking, should I be emitting as much energy and as much carbon as I do to attend them? Is that just? But then on the flip side, what if I don't have a choice to be able to do my job? What if that's the only place where I can do my job effectively? Now, there's a recent article on nature.com about a conference of UK astronomers. These beautiful astronomers shared their study on the fact that when they did their conference virtually, the carbon footprint was 3,000 times smaller than it would be assuming, the travel in Europe. And that's considering Europe, which is primarily like a lot of train travel. And yes, that does actually account for Zoom emissions, because we know that, using all of this server space and the capacity, that what that means for emissions. So even with that, the carbon footprint of their conference was 3,000 times smaller. So there really is a lot to unpack today. And I can't think of anyone better to do that than with our Canny co-host today. Eveline Renders talked a lot about this at the Canny European Summit. So this is her first appearance on the episode on the Canny Climate Dialogues podcast. She is wonderful, and I've gotten to work with her a lot as we put together the conference in November for the Canny Europe Summit. She presented on the future of international education conferences, wherein the discussion got pretty animated. If you haven't seen it already, you can definitely check it out on YouTube. There really isn't anyone I can think of that is better suited to unpack this and have this conversation with and welcome our guests with than Eveline. She also hosted what I can only describe as an actually cool virtual networking event. And so I think that there's so much potential, and Eveline sees that potential so clearly. And she has a tremendous amount of passion for creating engaging digital experiences, whether that's networking, learning, presenting. So I think she is clearly on the side of wanting the sector to move to more digital engagements because she sees so clearly the success that it can bring. So Eveline works as an information manager specialized in internationalization at Radboud University in the Netherlands. She translates between the users of student information systems, business intelligence, and customer relationship management systems. So the IT professionals who build and sustain sort of the processes. In 2020, she co-founded Leonova, which is a startup focused on providing training for support staff in higher education on internationalization, digitalization, and sustainability. And the intersection between sustainability and digitalization is what drives her to explore alternatives to the status quo in education logistics. So it is no surprise that she's a wonderful person to have on this podcast for this particular episode, as well as exploring the future of international education conferences. Plus, she's also just super, super smart and really, really delightful. I am so excited to have her here, and I'm so excited for you listeners to meet her. Welcome, Eveline. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Okay, so how's it going?
Well, let's see. I just started giving a workshop for 25 people from around Europe. It's about digitalization in the international office.
Oh.
And it's actually something that I've bootstrapped in the last 2 months with my partner, my business partner. And so I slept for 11 hours last night because I was so tired. But it's all fine. It takes a lot of energy, but it also gives a lot of energy.
That's outstanding. Congratulations for 11 hours of sleep. I know there are a lot of people in the sector who are not getting that at all. And so even if you get it once, congratulations. Good for you.
Thanks.
So it sounds like you've got a lot going on. So one of the things I just wanted to, because I'm so excited for our listeners to get to meet you. This is I already said, I think the world of you, that you did some really cool stuff at our CANI Summit, which brings me to the question of how you came to be involved with CANI. I'm hoping that you can share that with our listeners.
Yeah, it was, I think, about a year ago that I stumbled across the website because I was looking for sustainable initiatives in higher education specifically, and I was not finding that much. And then I stumbled across the website and I was thinking, oh, thank God someone is doing something about this and people are gathering. And because I was thinking there is momentum for this, why is no one doing this? So immediately I subscribed for updates, and then I think a few weeks later there came the announcement of the summit that was going to happen. Unfortunately, I couldn't really join the first one because my time zone is Central European time, so it was in the middle of the night for me. But then I heard about the European summit, so I was very excited, and I immediately sent an email saying that I could host a networking event like drinks, and I wanted to do a presentation, and I was very excited. So
that is a very classic CANI introduction to CANI. How'd you find CANI? Like literally searching for anything that was happening in this sector. It was very similar to mine, and just like sending an email being like, hi, I would like to be involved.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So you talked about the summit. Yeah, the Australia, New Zealand, and also North America summit. That day was that was a crazy day, but it was so good that we had the European summit. And I'm hoping that you can share with us, like, just chat about your experience with the summit, how, just share with the work that you did with our listeners and sort of how you felt about it.
Yeah. It was so much fun to participate in the summit. And it was so nice that we got together with this group every week to see how we were doing and if we had already had the speakers together and everything. And I found a colleague of mine at Radboud University where I work. And he's actually professor in epidemiology of tropical infectious diseases at the university's medical center. So I found him because I was asking around which colleagues are doing something about sustainability or with sustainability in academia. And our university's green office, they actually sent me this article that he wrote in a national Dutch newspaper. It was called "Scientists, it's out of our time to fly around the world for every congress." And I was like, yes, it is out of this time. I mean, it's not. And that article was written, I think, before the pandemic. So that was 2019. And then in the pandemic, he wrote, I think, something.
I hope it was just a big "I told you so."
Yeah. But still, there's still this feeling in academia that we do need to go back to the physical conferences. And I was feeling this momentum of making a statement like, oh, but we don't have to, there will be a conscious choice to make. And that's a very, very important thing to do. So I was very happy when he responded to my enthusiastic email saying like, is there anything I can help you with? That was just my question. I was like, I love that you're volunteering your time, next to being a professor full-time, you're volunteering your time to do something about this consciousness of sustainability in academia. Can I help you in any way? And he said, well, actually, I'm doing some research. I'm doing qualitative research among academics about virtual conferences. And I thought I want to join. So I did. And we got together and we had some productive conversations about it. And from that followed the presentation that we gave during the summit.
That was a very interesting conversations. And dear listeners, you know what I'm going to say. It is available on the Canny YouTube channel. So please go make sure that you check it out. There's an extended, the conversation that you had with the team from ISEF and API, so was really great and brought up a lot of really good conversations. So there was a presentation, a panel discussion, and then there was an extended panel discussion because there was just so much to talk about. And so please go check that out. But your work with Taeyoon did not end there. It continued.
Actually, from that presentation, we were thinking that there's also an article in this, topic. So we just wrote an article together, also with 3 other colleagues, one from Japan, and it's about the tips from the first wave of academic conferences, virtual academic conferences. So I already forget the word virtual. That's fun. For me, it's just an academic conference. But so I even forgot to mention that it's virtual. So we gathered these tips and tricks about virtual conferences, like, should you have a poster presentation, online? Does that work or doesn't that work? Our interviewees actually thought that it doesn't work to have a poster session online, but you can replace it with other things that are very much working in the virtual space.
I love that. I'm really excited for that. And we will be sharing it when it sort of is something that we can. So if you're a subscriber to the Canny newsletter, you will be sort of among the first because Eveline knows she has to send it to us when it is available for circulation.
Yeah. We were trying to get it published in a serious science magazine, but I'm not sure where that stands. So I'm actually going to check up on that when we finish this conversation.
Right, because
but I will make sure to ask that we can share it with Kenny, perhaps even pre-publish. Perhaps we can just share it in this state because it's finished. So
that is exciting. And that, I think, one of the things we do want to do for all of our listeners today's episode, as I mentioned, is that we're talking about it from the conference perspective and understanding where they're coming from, but there will be conversations to be had about how to be more, what responsibilities we have as participants in these virtual conferences, as practitioners. And so I think that the work that Eveline is doing, as I mentioned in my glowing introduction, that she actually ran a very cool networking session, which is hard to come by, and what we can do. And so we want to meet people where they are. We understand this is a weird time. We understand that we've been conditioned in the sector to do this for a long, long time. And we're not suggesting that it should, that it should just 100% disappear. But there's the conscious choices of the value that can be derived from them, and sort of, are they worth the emissions, the waste that they produce? And so I'll be keen to have that discussion, because I know that that's one that's really important that's coming up. Okay, so one of the things that we love hearing is, obviously, like, you found Canny, and that was the how you found Canny. But why, right? Like, the why are you so involved? And we always say that it's like caring about the planet, of course, and that's common sense, and it's not quite as common as we would think. But like, what is your why? Like, what is your climate story, and how you came to be? Like, you gave a lot of your time for this presentation. You've been giving a lot of your time for Canny. You've given a lot of your time for us today. So, like, what is your climate story?
Yeah. On the one hand, it's the same boring story, like, oh, I care about the planet. No, but I feel like I'm truly interested in how we can contribute from an individual level, but also on a systemic level. So when I talk about a systemic level, I mean, you can see it in your own friend group, or you can look at your institution where you work, or perhaps even your city or your country, or your the whole of Europe, for instance. And I try to see how I can contribute in a small way, just by doing something, because I always like to do something in practice and not really talk about it too much. And then I like to talk about it afterwards. So I never say practice what you preach. I always say preach what you practice, because then the practice comes first, and then you can preach it. Because you can always, you can preach a lot, but first practice. So that's nice.
That's such a good way of saying that. Yeah.
So I was already involved in a few projects, and some of them didn't work at all. I was involved in trying to start up a sustainable eco-village. And the group has been working tirelessly for 10 years already to get this eco-village going, and to build it with a housing corporation and with the local government. And it's so hard. So I was president of this association for a year, because I never do things halfway. I just do it full or not. But I found that it was so tiresome to do this and to keep running into these roadblocks, that I thought I could better focus my energies somewhere where it's working, and just kind of give up on this little idealistic dream for now. So a few weeks ago, I started a sustainable clothing swap, which is Corona-proof, because of course we already did we did clothing swaps with friends, where we all come to one house and we get all the secondhand clothing that everybody has, and we swap them. But now we have actually a whole chain of households in the city, where these bags of clothes are going from one house to the next every 3 days. And it's an initiative that was founded in Amsterdam at the beginning of this year. No, at the beginning of last year, I think, when Corona was just hitting. And right now there are over, I think, 5,000 people in the Netherlands who are doing this. It's crazy. It's really crazy. But so those are little things that we can do that makes us feel like, okay, we're participating in a way, in a social way, to also making this more of a conscious decision for people.
Yeah, I love the way you talk about, the systems that you're in, either and that can be like a community, it could be your friend group, or it could be your institution or your sort of geographic political region, right? So, and what I love, and I see it in everything that you do, is you're so keen on having that climate impact on everything, all of your work, right? Your clothing swap, the work that you do, being so committed to virtual. And then, I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I'm so glad that you are here, because your ability to sort of engage with technology and really make it work for these impactful interactions and engagements will be really important for the future. And I can't imagine anyone better to have this conversation with. So thank you so much for sharing your story. I'm glad our listeners have had a chance to get to know you a little bit. And surely over the course of this interview with the CBIE and KAIE team, we'll get to know you even better and get to appreciate you as I do. And we will have many, many opportunities, because I think we want to hear a lot more perspectives. So thank you for sharing your story. And before we go to your interview, a fun little ad read. Okay, so here we go. Our second official ad read. It is Sponsor O'Clock. Am I going to get tired of this? Probably not, honestly. I really love our presenting sponsor. Plus, I think it makes my parents proud. So here we go. The University of Auckland's International Office is proud to sponsor the Canny Climate Dialogues podcast. New Zealand, as you know, is a unique place to think about climate through the lens of their Indigenous cultures. Leading the world's universities in the Times Higher Ed Global Impact Rankings, as they work towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the international team at the University of Auckland share you, our listeners' concerns about climate action and international education. And the University of Auckland is answering the world's call. I can confirm I'm so excited. Since our last episode, there's been some really great stuff coming out from our friends at Auckland University. They've created some really wonderful stories about how their institution is advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. And in each of their Sustainable Development Goals, they're contributing a lot of really interesting content, hearing some stories from their team. So I'm very excited to share. In our next episode, we're going to be sort of sharing one of those clips from a series of videos that they made. So super bonus. If you're on YouTube, you'll be able to check it out, but they tell really beautiful audio stories as well. So I'm really looking forward to sharing that. But once again, a big thank you to our friends at the University of Auckland's International Office. Very proud to be partnering with them, and we're very glad that they are helping sustain our little podcast. So today's episode, we have a powerhouse of guests. We have 3 guests, 2 from the CBIE. So we're joined by Larissa Bezo. She's the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Bureau of International Education. After years of distinguished public career service, Larissa continued her work in international development and through various senior level assignments with the World Bank and the International Center for Policy Studies. Larissa has over 25 years of professional experiences, including 15 in the international development and education sector. And I am so delighted that she is here today. She's going to be joined by Melissa Payne. Melissa Payne is the Director of Membership, Research, and Learning at the Canadian Bureau of International Education. And prior to joining the CBIE in 2014, Melissa worked with a number of education-focused nonprofit organizations and higher education institutions in Asia and Africa, facilitating partnerships across cultures to build organizational capacity, as well as deliver learning programs in organizational development, communications, teacher training, and ESL studies. Both Larissa and Melissa are also super lovely and delightful. And so I'm very glad that you all will get to meet them today. And they have a lot of really good insight given their experience as they just outlined. And I think it's going to be really wonderful. And last but certainly not least is we are joined by Luis Kawachi, who is the Senior Manager of the Conference of the Americas on International Education, CAIE or CAIE. Which is organized by the Inter-American Organization for Higher Education. For 20 years, Luis has been working on the advancement of internationalization and academic cooperation in the hemisphere. It is a downright treat to have him here. We met at the CBIE conference, actually, of all places. So this is a really wonderful conversation, and I could not, I feel incredibly privileged to get to have this dialogue on this podcast for you listeners. So everyone, welcome. It's so nice to see you. How's it going?
Everything is doing fine.
Thanks.
Yeah. Nodding heads all around.
Here. Yep. No, we're happy to be here.
This is great. Well, thank you so much. Just a quick round. Luis, where are you joining from today?
From a very beautiful corner of Quebec called the Eastern Townships. Just outside Montreal, about an hour east of Montreal. So beautiful rolling hills and a lot of snow. So it's perfect.
Evelien, you're joining from?
I'm joining from the Netherlands, from Nijmegen. It's actually quite cold here, but we had our first taste of spring just a few weeks ago. So I'm happy.
And Larissa, Melissa, you guys are joining from?
We're joining from Ottawa, traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. I'm really delighted to be with all of you.
Absolutely. Just
Beautiful.
Down the road from Luis.
Yeah, also representing with the snow. So in Vancouver today is no snow, sidewalks, and almost sun. Okay, well, listen, thank you so much for being here. As our listeners would have heard, I'm a big fan of all of your work and a big fan of all of your conferences and the discussions that we've had over the last year. And it's been clear that there's been a conscious awareness and effort to include sustainability more at the forefront of the work, and which is why you're also generously here today. And what I just wanted to ask was to Larissa and Melissa from the CBIE team, can you share with our listeners what is your view of CBIE's role in advancing sustainability and climate action in the international education sector?
Thanks, CJ. I mean, we agree with you. I certainly do. I think increasingly we're seeing a move towards more conscious decision making. And I don't think our sector is unique to that. But I think, we as an organization, hold certain values to be true. And I think those values like sustainable practice, like a commitment to innovative action, I think those are the values that really drive us to want to do our part in contributing towards a sustainable future, when we think of those future generations. And for us as well, I think recognizing that we do act in that global space, the education sector has a very important role to play and a value to bring to society at large. And I think with that comes some very profound responsibility, social responsibility, and, a commitment to be sensitive to places where, we can make conscious decisions to do better. And I think that's the space that we've been exploring, but I will confess up front, we're really learning. We're by no means leaders in this, but we're excited to have the conversation and to kind of push ourselves out of our comfort zones as we try to think, very concretely about how we do that better, each month, each year, each event, that stands ahead of us.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think, like Larissa says, I'm a learner. I think we all are really as we move forward, thinking about how we can do things different, do things better, but just having the opportunity to make things more inclusive, right? We're thinking, this conversation really lends itself really well to that inclusive conversation, making international education for all, right? And how can we do that? And how can we do that in a sustainable way and make international education more accessible. So I think that's part of CBIE's role. And when we're thinking about how we're bringing the community together and what kind of initiatives, activities we're doing for them, it's how do we do this in a way that we can reach the most people, or we can provide the benefits of international education for each and every one of us out there.
Yeah, because the reality is, I mean, I think our work goes beyond what happens on campuses and in classrooms. And we, along with, others, need to think consciously about the choices that we're making, and how we organize and how we convene. And, to Melissa's point, and how we create, those maximally inclusive spaces, but sustainable ones.
It sounds wonderful. It seems like you're very actively learning also on this field. And I'm curious, Louise, so how is sustainability and climate action viewed differently given your focus on Latin America?
It's an interesting, thank you first for the question and for allowing us to be here. It's a very interesting approach because Latin America in general is very diverse, and societies throughout the continent are just very diverse internally itself. And so there's different levels of awareness about the environment and about sustainability. There's also different levels of information. How ready are we? How much can we actually help or contribute? And so from the higher education sector and the international education sector itself, there's I think we had been approaching our activity from a goals-oriented approach, and I think we're marrying back to the awareness of our environment. Latin America is very close to its own environment, soil, land, diversity. All of that is part of something that was, I guess, taken for granted as being part of the resources that are available at hand. And as we start reflecting upon this and learning about this, then there's this kind of process of bringing value to the bounty around us. And so how do we restructure what we're doing so that we can still follow the path of what we're trying to do in academic collaboration, but then just appreciate and value what we're doing in there. And so there's a bunch of institutions and a bunch of countries specifically that are working on that very conscientiously, how to instill this mindset of sustainability in what we do as individuals, as citizens, as future professionals, as members of society, and appreciate what's already given and make the most of it. So it's a process, but it's a very interesting one, I find.
Yeah, it's a very interesting process to see how we're connecting with these resources.
Thank you for sharing that.
Disclosure, I was born and raised in northern Mexico. So, I mean, I speak of personal experience.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that
I'm just for personal experience and seeing how that works and how is that evolving as part of our own societies.
Yeah, and I think that personal experience is such a huge driver in a lot of the things that we're doing and talking about and being able to sort of relate to and therefore internalize. And so one of the big parts that is bringing us together is, I mentioned in the intro, is yours were both the last two conferences I went to before COVID hit. So I was in Colombia in October, and then I went to the CBIE conference in Winnipeg. And I mentioned I also just love the conferences so much, but we know that these are drivers of emissions in our sector. And so I wanted to ask Eveline to share a little bit of information and context for our listeners about some of the research that Eveline, you've done. So I'll leave that space to you, and then sort of we can kick off the conversation a little bit about conferences specifically.
Yeah. So last year for the Kenny conference, for the summit, it's called, I gave a presentation together with Teun Boesema, and it was about the future of conferences. And for that presentation, we also researched the OIHE conference, the 2019 conference on diversity and inclusivity of higher education. And that was held in the Asia Pacific in Malaysia. And there were 2,500 participants from all continents who traveled a total of 35.7 million kilometers to and from the conference. So that's a distance equaling 46 return trips to the moon. And it's an emission of an average of 9,900 European households for a week. So it's a huge emission for one conference. And this is not to shame them, of course, because this is for every of the conferences that were organized in 2019 and before that. But what we looked at is what's the difference if we do this in a biannual way or perhaps in a hybrid way. So for a biannual conference, of course, you slash this emission with 50%. But if you organize a hybrid conference or even a decentralized conference, which was very interesting, then you take 5 decentralized locations and you see if people fly to there or go preferably by train or with other modes of transport, then you can slash the emission by 60%. So that's just to look at the options. And I think that we're very quickly evolving in these options.
Yeah. And it's really, thank you for that. And I think that your presentation at the summit was super engaging. And I know that you and I have sent articles to each other about other conferences and sort of the impact of going virtual this year. There's been some conferences that have shared that information, and I've also shared earlier was that these conferences have a tremendous impact on building partnerships, right? So there is these really important pieces because the UN Sustainable Development Goals, number 17 is partnerships for the goal. And these are these really important pieces. So how do we sort of move forward and what does the future look like? But I thought, Luis, if you could share your context with us, because the CAIE hasn't yet missed a conference because of COVID. The CAIE is every other year. Mm-hmm. And so you guys didn't miss your 2020 conference. And so I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about the drivers of that decision at first, and those connections to sustainability and climate action now.
Thank you. It's an excellent question, and it's a multi-layered question. So I'll try to be I'll try to make sense.
I love layers.
The Conference of the Americas started about 10 years ago. We're organizing the 7th edition as we speak, and so because the concern about this forum was to bring together a continental platform, and I should mention CBIE is one of the founding members of CAIE, and the original one was hosted in conjunction with CBIE. So. Because it's a continental forum and part of the objectives to actually be flipping destinations, it takes time to actually work with the local host country and the ministries and the ecosystem and all of the people that need to be organized around what we want to do, because it is actually their opportunity to showcase what they do. And so I think this idea of reaching the 2-year, the biannual structure was a result of simply convenience, because you need to prepare for that. So that's probably the logistical component. I came to CAIE to start running the conference in 2016. So the Montreal 2017 was my first one. And I immediately I have always agreed with the fact that it's every other year. You touched upon partnerships and relationships and the rest. I think this off year allows for any of these initiatives to actually take hold, take root, unravel, happen, and be able to reconvene in 2 years with tangible results. So there's an actual benefit to that from the evolution of the relationship, institutional or otherwise, out of the original contexts that are made within the framework of a conference. And then you allow for that to happen. And so you come back and report back after there's been some maturity to what has been done. Today, however, you're right. I mean, we came back from Colombia and we knew that 2021 was going to be Chile. Now we're forced to go virtual. And it's a fascinating experience, because, I find it even more appealing that we're doing it this way, because we're actually having to there has to be a participant's engagement, like a conscious effort in saying, I need to build the relationships, I need to procure the partnerships, I need to get in touch with more people and then make it happen. So so we're being driven this time to go virtual out of, fortuitous reasons, but learning how to operate in this virtual environment, I think it's actually very positive for everyone. And then it addresses a question of equity and access and the impact that we're doing in what we do. So now the bigger challenge is, how do we construct these events so that we can guarantee that they deliver what we're all expecting them to deliver? And so that's where the challenge is at. It's in the design process. But I'm fascinated by the challenge, to be honest. And so I'm like, it just keeps going in my mind.
Yeah, great to hear. Great to hear the challenge being tackled by people who like challenges and like the learning process. I'm curious, Larissa, so how has COVID changed your perception of conferences?
Similarly, I think there were some immediate considerations, and obviously the public health measures were something that we needed to navigate. As CJ rightly put, our last face-to-face conference was Winnipeg, November 2019. And then last summer, we made the decision. At that time, there were so many moving pieces to go virtual, obviously in the first instance, because we were concerned about the health of our delegates and what was happening in the communities. We were supposed to be in Toronto. And so it was a huge learning curve for us as an organization, to figure out how to mount a virtual conference, to think about all those different dimensions of kind of the face-to-face conference that people know and love, myself included. But, how do you take those elements into a virtual space where people still feel connected, that they still feel like it's, the annual conference that they know and love for our Canadian international education sector. But how do you innovate around that? And so we had a pretty short runway, as I say, because we really only had clarity that, we were kind of even physically released from our commitments in the physical conference center in Toronto in July, and gave us a few months to basically pull together a virtual conference. So that was really kind of learning by trial and error, learning by fire, trying to figure that out. And it was a great, great experience. I think it created a lot of space for us to innovate. And I think where our level of comfort, somewhat level of comfort, I don't think everyone on the team would agree, but I think where there was some degree of comfort was we kind of dipped our toe in those waters by hosting our first ever virtual kind of large event, which was in June of last year. We'd hosted kind of a one-day symposium on reimagining international education. We felt the community needed to connect and have conversation. We'd never done anything like that, but we thought, what, it's a day, it can't be that onerous. Let's try. And it was interesting. Because you were interacting with new vendors, so we'd reached out and forged a bit of a kind of a partnership with Tech Adaptica, for example, trying to create, an engaging virtual space. That was my first attempt at creating an avatar and trying to network with people. I think for those on our team and certainly outside of the team in our community who are perhaps less tech savvy and comfortable, that was a huge leap. And I think there are those who maybe created an avatar and just kind of stood on the sidelines and watched, unless somebody approached them and kind of prompted them to have conversation. Was it perfect? No, lots of, lessons learned. But I agree with Louis that the virtual space, is a great equalizer in that it provides much more access, much more equitable access to those opportunities, because you're not necessarily dealing with all of those additional kind of travel costs, the ancillary costs around accommodation, all the movement, transportation, and all of that. And so from that perspective, we were excited to see, we were sitting down with Melissa and looking at, what the 2020 conference experience was as our first full virtual conference. And what we saw was a significant increase in the number of international delegates, which was wonderful. And so we tried to innovate around that, even creating kind of a world pavilion where, there would be spaces for them to showcase, what they had to bring or what their institutions were doing. But many of those delegates were ones that, likely would not have come or could not have afforded to come to a face-to-face conference. So we saw that as a real benefit. And I know kind of in November, as we were wrapping up our kind of 5-day virtual marathon, I had shared at that time, and it's something we've been talking about, well before the pandemic. We wanted to move towards a hybrid model. We do think there's value in gathering in person, and we touched on, many of you touched on some of those elements, especially the networking pieces. And I think those random kind of interactions that often generate some of the most creative outcomes from a lot of the events that many of us attend. but it was our intention to move in that direction. And I think one of the positive experiences we've had is the pandemic forced us to, allowed us the opportunity to accelerate, some of our experimentation around this. We're going to be virtual in 2021. Our intention is to kind of, move towards an incremental hybrid approach, and there's still lots to kind of figure out. And one of the challenges for us, we're a charitable organization. We're not for profit. And so, there are a lot of, I think, wonderful ideas in terms of how you can deliver, even a hybrid conference. But for us, we also have to weigh and do something that's sustainable, both in, environmental, but also financial terms. And so trying to, find the right tools and the right ways to do some of that. That's the piece that that's the journey that we're on in terms of what that future holds.
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that. And because I attended the virtual conference, and I am biased here. I mentioned earlier I attended service providers or like a speaker, and so not being in the institution side, our listeners will know I've never been in an institution, but sort of I'm involved in the sector in different capacities, and I loved it. Like, I loved it so much. And I know that I've said that to both of you and congratulated you after the event, but that's just me. And I was wondering if you could share sort of the type of feedback you might have received from different speakers, sponsors, attendees, if you were able to sort of share that with us. The good, the bad, the ugly.
Sure. I can jump in a little bit. Yeah, it was interesting. Really happy to hear. Thank you for sharing that. It's always nice to have some positive vibes about the work we do around conferences come our way. So thanks for that plug. It's funny that you think, like, what are some of the takeaways or how different was it? But really, when it came down to it, people said the same thing. They want more networking time. Everybody wants more networking time. They really loved the speakers that we had. And I think, as we have talked about a number of times, because we were virtual and because there are no travel costs, the diversity in speakers and who we can connect and bring together, that was something that was, I think, a little bit extra and a little bit, impactful this year in the virtual space than it's been before. So, that's something that we want to take into the future as well, as making sure that our conversations are really bringing together people that, not necessarily would know of us or be able to attend at our conference in Canada. So, so we did have a lot of great things about that. Doing the virtual space, the accessibility piece was another thing that we had spent a lot of time thinking about, closed captioning, interpretation, those kind of pieces to make the actual attending and being able to participate in the learning available. And so, doing that virtually, there are some benefits. There are some really tangible ways that you can embed some of that accessibility components into it as well. So there was a lot of appreciation around that. And that virtual space gives you that opportunity. So lots of feedback about just being able to do things a little bit more. But it's virtual, so we have to think about length of things and how do we jam pack all this great learning into maybe short snippets, because you're sitting in front of your computer at the end of the day. And so we had lots of great feedback, but just thinking about how going virtual doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to take what you do in person and translate that exactly into what we do online, right? So I think that was some really great lessons learned that we have, that, okay, how can we, bring some diversity not only to who we're hearing from or who we're talking to, but also, the length and the kinds of session or the ways we engage with each other online. So lots of great stuff about that. And then, the networking piece, yes, we don't get to do that organic, chit chat with people over breakfast or that fun stuff that we all love and miss. And I think, there's not really anything that replaces that. We're human. We like to see each other in person. But there's something to be said about some of these online platforms that, automatically connect you. You have these matchmaking, networking activities that you can do online where you can type in what you want to talk about, and then you're connected to people that you might not have been able to run into at the conference. I think it's really helpful for people that aren't super duper networkers, the ones that come and you sit at the breakfast table thinking like, oh, what do I say to that? I want to say hi, like I'd love to talk to you, but how do I start, So I think there's some really great benefits in the virtual space for people to be able to connect that we don't think about, or for people with different personalities and different ways of communicating to be able to benefit from all these really great parts of a conference.
Surprising perhaps, but very true. I 100% relate to that person at the breakfast table saying, oh my God, what do I say? So I loved just being able to like chat message someone and be like, hey, you seem really interesting.
Right. It's so great. I mean, that's the same. Even when you're a new professional, I think I remember being like, I can do this. I have to talk to one person in this room, right? I'm going to do it. And, this kind of, it makes it a little, just that much more easier to do it. So I think that's a really great benefit.
That's wonderful. So thank you so much. What I'm hearing is two themes, and they actually align really nicely with sort of the future discussion. So what I'm hearing a lot of is like the equity and the inclusion piece, as well as the like importance of the networking piece. And I'd like to dig into the future of both of those things, but Evelyn, being the master network orchestrator that she is, I'm going to sort of defer to her on that one, but wanted to dig in a little bit, Larissa and Melissa, on the topic of, because the focus on sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or like justice, diversity and inclusion, equity and inclusion, were really highlighted in your conference in November. And it was, I think we're seeing a lot more of that. And as we talk about the future and the ability of these online platforms to equalize sort of the playing field or increase access. I'm keen to see how you see moving forward with the conference as we transition. I didn't know actually that the next upcoming conference was virtual. Big fan. Can't wait to sponsor.
Well, Melissa might shoot me because we haven't actually made that news public, but we just did through the podcast.
Breaking news.
There you go. You're exclusive. CBIE Virtual 2020.
Guys, our first Canny exclusive. How awesome. This is great. So it's great to hear that. But I do also hear that the importance of the in-person stuff. So I'm curious to hear, when it comes to one of the real, and I've said this, I'm maybe on every podcast, we can't really have this conversation about like climate action without really talking about climate justice, right? Where the people who are most harmed by climate change are people who are at least contributing to it, or at least able to take opportunities that would contribute to it, like traveling to a conference. And so, when we talk about prioritizing, if we did have to go the offset model, prioritizing perhaps students over practitioners. And so I'm wondering, when we talk about the future of conferences in the context of equity, and you look at like vaccines, like who even knows when you look at the vaccine distribution and you're seeing countries in Africa and Southeast Asia, like maybe not even getting vaccinated for like a couple of years. And so what does that look like in terms of how do we take that justice piece? How do you see that for the future?
I mean, I think that intersection that you just touched on, CJ, I think is at the core of this. And it's the piece that we need, it's the nut we need to crack, right? And I think we started having those conversations. One of the other things that came to mind as you were talking was, and, we had a very deliberate conversation about this at our leadership table last year, even in the lead up to last year's conference, was, it's one thing to bring, and to consciously work towards bringing a diversity of voices, for example, through things like speakers or presenters or contributors. But there's something that stands behind that. And that is, how do you engage that diversity of delegates? How do you reach those different communities? And I think that's one of the pieces that we're really trying to be conscious about. I mean, we're about to launch a call for proposals for the 2021 conference, and Melissa knows this really well. But the key piece on our mind is, how do we do better in diversifying who actually contributes to the conference? How do we reach them? If they're not on the usual social media feeds, or perhaps they're excluded from that just by virtue of their own community realities, how do we intentionally create those spaces. And it was really the same thing that led us to last year, with input from kind of our allies in our community in Canada to say, we need to create spaces, even in a virtual conference, to bring a diversity of delegates to the table. I mean, we created a bursary for that reason, because we felt it was important. And we didn't know how that would unfold. I mean, it was our first effort in that way. I mean, the demand far exceeded even the bursaries that we had available. I mean, we could have given 5 times as many bursaries to delegates who wanted to be a part of the conversation. And so it's something that we're going to try to work on this year. But I think you raise, that fundamental issue that we need to figure out, because there's the piece about us bringing about changes in our activities, the usual stuff we do, so that we're minimizing, let's say, our impact on the natural resources and environment, but that whole kind of disproportionate piece about us having the impact, but also coming from a place of privilege where, we can make decisions that can have a very meaningful and impactful difference in the positive or in the negative sense, and needing to be very conscious about that. And I think the answer is, it's a lot of nuanced gray. I don't think there's a black and white answer. And I also think, there's a whole piece here, and that's where even in the conference conversation last year, the whole raising awareness piece about the impact of our activities, right? And thinking about that consciously. I think, those conversations have gone on for a number of years, but I think increasingly more and more people are coming to that conversation. And I think it's incumbent upon, associations such as ours to create those spaces, and where we're able to kind of lead by example. So whether that be making a decision to go virtual or making a decision to have a hybrid event, but thinking about then how do you connect, to those that are impacted by what we're doing and those that can make the most significant difference.
Thank you. Yes. I really like what you're saying about creating these collaborative and safe spaces also, where more people can contribute to these conferences that you're organizing. And you also mentioned before the networking aspect, where we can all agree, it's a very important aspect of a conference to have these very small, spontaneous meetings with people. And how do you actually facilitate that in a virtual space? It's really hard to do. I tried to do it a lot, and actually it's getting better every time. So I feel like there is this way to do it. And as more people around the world are experiencing that it can be done, it also creates the mindset for people to actually engage in a better way online. So they're learning how to create the safe space in a virtual context. I'm also curious for Louise, because you are already organizing these conferences on a biannual level. And in between, do you also create these spaces where your conference members can network in between the conferences?
It's been a pending task, I think, because of the nature of the beast. You focusing on the event and not necessarily on guaranteeing the continuity of the interaction. So one of the things that I have personally the privilege of holding in my hands every single proposal. And so by doing that and reading all of that, I make it a point to identify who should meet who throughout the entire conference. And I run around for 4 or 5 days saying, you need to meet these people or send an email and get them to actually get started, because in some ways I'm the one who gets to identify who should meet who, right? But then you kind of trust that this space that we share will allow them for something that is, in fact, feasible, will carry on. And it has been the case. So for that, I'm happy. Being nosy has been actually very positive for everyone. And for me to learn what everybody is doing, but also to facilitate these relevant conversations that are designed to happen. Now, one of the things that I still have in my pocket for this year, or for the rest of the coming months before we reach October, is to relaunch our conference app. which obviously has the entire registry of everyone who participated in Columbia. There's the record of everything that was presented. There's the record of every conversation that happened, and sort of use that tool as a rekindling tool for the conversations that could be had virtually now that we won't meet for Chile. And so I say it's a pending task because it's been in the back of my mind, how do we guarantee that these conversations have a space in the off year? And I think that may be the way to do that, just this permanent networking platform that is directed or motivated by shared interest, where you can do, thematic matchmaking and suddenly find a partner across the globe that is actually sharing your same interest. And it's all in the palm of your hand. We've started saying that it's been a learning process, and I think it is still ongoing. We haven't thought about these tools that we already had as having a continuity in time, or being able to facilitate the continuity of the community of knowledge that we're building. And this may be then the tipping point when we have to sort of conceptualize what we do. How do we guarantee continuity? How do we make it relevant and facilitate these structured conversations or random conversations in a continuous fashion, and not necessarily restricted by the face-to-face? And so that I hope I can still deliver that. And if I don't now, I will, like January 2022, because it just needs to happen. There's too much knowledge, there's so much willingness, there's institutional capacity. It just needs to have a space where it carries on as a community.
Yeah, this sounds wonderful. It almost sounds, if I may say so, that conferences are changing into some kind of like elongated networking communities,
This continuous
that's a whole other
community
discussion, of course, but it's about how we're actually also changing the business in the same time. So
There's a whole conversation to be had and noted for future podcasts. As mentioned earlier, is that Eveline really like the event that you did after the Canny Event Summit was super engaging and fun. I know we talked about that earlier, and networking remains such an important part of this sector. But I do think like there's, we're just learning. We're just starting to get into this virtual networking space. And I think that, we've shown the capacity to adapt so quickly. But there is sort of some responsibility that we as conference participants need to sort of take on in terms of acknowledging that it's going to be different. And we need to try new things, and maybe it be a little bit uncomfortable, but find that like, this is going to be okay. At least we're not sitting at a table worrying what to say to the person, or awkwardly looking at name badges to see who you're talking to, or trying to remember someone's name. So there's the good and the bad, but I just wanted to wrap it up with this last question. And you've been so generous with your time and with your perspectives, and I'm impossibly grateful. But the people who listen to this podcast, our listeners, everyone who's still with us after this amount of time, they're often keen to hear about steps that they can take. What can they do? How can they help? We are the Climate Action Network, after all. So I'm hoping that you can share with our listeners, some of which are members of your associations and organizations, have attended the conferences, CBIE or CAE. How can they help you lead and drive forwards towards a more like climate conscious sector? So Luis, I'm going to sort of hand over the proverbial microphone to you, and then sort of Melissa and Larissa for some sort of final words after that.
Thank you. And thank you, ladies, for letting me go first. So I think when you're asking, it's like, what can participants do, and what do we all do as a community to make sure that this is sustainable going forward, and that this is here to stay? This is what I would say. Just let's make sure that virtual is here to stay. Make sure you bet on it. Make sure that you take part of it. Make sure that you engage with us as providers of learning spaces, and that you share your priorities and your interests and what you want from us, and be a part of it. Because the more that we participate, the more that we validate the process, the more feedback we get from you, the better we can actually tailor the activity so that it is relevant for you. I missed to mention, I was talking, CBIE is this like, hemispheric gathering. And one of the things that is always a challenge for us is how to be representative of the diversity of the population of the continent. You get Canada and the United States in one end, and you get Chile and Brazil on the other end, but more evolved and developed activities. But then you get Honduras, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Bolivia in the middle. They still deserve to be part of the conversation. So allowing, this is a vehicle for us to guarantee that what we're doing is reaching everyone on equal footing. So, bet on it. Help us make sure that virtual is here to stay. I believe the model is here to stay. I kind of agree with Evelyn in which the evolution will be. That's something that I had actually proposed originally for CBIE, to say, let's have a broken down conference by national centers and sort of allow for that to be just this broken structure. There's no roadmap. We're writing it as we go along. And so thinking about these collaborative approaches that may facilitate, it may be a relevant way to go about it. But at the end, we're all relying on you to help us validate this process and guarantee that it suits what we're all expecting to get out of it. And so, with that, the emails available, send us notes, send us, suggestions. Is like, this is what I'd like to see. Again, we're writing it as we go, and it's a learning process for everyone. So the more that we can tailor it for our new reality allows us to make it inclusive, available, equitable, accessible, and at the same time guarantee that we're being sustainable in what we do. And I think that's important.
That was so well said. I think that's great. And absolutely. And like, we are always open for suggestions and hearing from the community at CBIE as well, and things that we could do different or things that we could do to support. Because, in the end, that's what we're here for. We're here to be that convening space, to support those collaborations, to support that learning in the sector. The one thing I would add is, be open and ready for things to look different and for change, even when we move back into that probably hybrid space. But even when we're meeting in person, things probably won't look the same. I think about convention centers that are, not putting tablecloths on the tables anymore because of to reduce, their costs around laundry and things like that. I mean, the spaces are going to look different. What's just that experience that we're so used to, especially we've been to these nice hotels and these beautiful convention centers and stuff. I mean, we're all thinking as organizers, and also, with the suppliers and the venues that we're working with, we're looking to make those changes that are small or even more significant impact on our practices to make things more sustainable, to think about these things. So, I mean, I think we have to, I hate using the word the new normal. I maybe you can edit that out, but, things are going to look different. Things are going to feel different. And really, it's for the betterment of all of us. So we just have to be ready and open to that change that's going to be here as we move into the future.
Yeah, and I agree with Melissa and Luis completely. I mean, I think it's about the openness. I mean, that's really, I think, the piece that we would ask of the community. And I think, I look back on the last couple of years, even in a face-to-face conference environment, a few years ago, we made a decision, for example, to do away with the printed booklet. And there were those that grumbled, and we said, but it was a conscious, sustainable choice. But what we also did is we, at that point, invested heavily in terms of a much more functional app, to try to connect people. And so, you're trying to make those conscious decisions, but I think, wanting to see openness. And I think there is a lot of it in the community, certainly much more positive feedback and embracing of some of these changes than those that are perhaps fighting the change. But I mean, one of the memories that stands out very vividly for me, we wrapped up a development program recently that CBIE ran for many years in Ukraine, in fact, on access to justice. And it was an institution building project. And our wrap-up conference was in the capital city of Kyiv. And, it's interesting what's happening in so many country contexts in terms of embracing this whole sustainability piece. But one of the things that's a memory that will remain with me forever was, we tried to make conscious choices around accommodation and around, audiovisual decisions and comms and exhibits and all these different, elements of conference that you would have in a face-to-face piece. But one of them was around food and beverage. And so little known to most of the world, Ukrainians are actually very, very innovative when it comes to kind of sustainable, not only just fair trade and sustainable, but actually, biodegradable, compostable food. And so, all of our food was not only local, but they ended up being served on kind of a new Ukrainian invention, which was edible buckwheat plates and cutlery. And so we had our food, and then we ate the food, the plates and cutlery on which it was served, and we consumed the drinks in the same way. And all the Canadian delegates that were part of this international conference kept looking at me like I never thought I'd be doing something like this. And I thought it's a first for me as well. But it just showed, it wasn't a big leap, right? And it was something that was locally driven. And I think this is the biggest piece for us is, as we likely will see, kind of a hybrid CBIE conference in the future, it's thinking about some of those local elements, right? And how we connect those global and local considerations as we try to make those sustainable choices. It's not going to be perfect. There'll be lots of things that we need to continue to improve. But I know when we sat down a few years ago and started to talk about, okay, how do we move to hybrid and to really consider the impact of even a face-to-face conference? I remember reading at some point, I think it was like one attendee produces about 1.52 kilograms of waste a day. You times that by a typical 3-day CBIE conference, you times that by 1,000 delegates, that's over 5,000 kilograms of waste that you're generating even in that local environment. That's equivalent to, 4, 5, maybe 6 compact cars, just to give perspective. How do you even consciously deal with some of those things? Those are the things that I think we need to figure out. And, I know we've been talking internally about even just trying to articulate kind of a sustainability policy for our events, whether that be our annual conference, whether that be other pieces. But I think it's the openness and the willingness to kind of embark on the journey with us as we bump our way through some of these lessons, to find a more sustainable way to gather as a community, whether that be locally or globally.
I love that. That's a beautiful note to end on. It's like, what do you need from our community? How can we help? What action can we take? It's like, you mentioned the grumbling and the openness, like dial back some of that, and because of your openness, that will naturally come. So it's like, in terms of action, that's pretty light. So it's nice to know that like we can support. And I know that there are people in positions of financial support when you talk about being an organization that is charitable and there are sponsors. So like there is the value and recognizing the value. So there are people with the power for purse strings that, supporting those initiatives, whether or not they're in person. I think there's certainly some action, and I know I'm one of them. So I'm like speaking to myself and others like me in the sector who are like, yeah, as far as actions that we can take, like delegates participating, being present, trying your hand at networking virtually, we're all learning and adapting. So I just wanted to thank you so much. There will be more. This is a great, like sort of hemispheric and the Americas perspective. I think there will be many more, and I'm super keen to get into that. So thank you so much to Luis, Melissa, Larissa, and Eveline. Your first ride in the Canny co-host chair.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Take care.
The Canny Climate Dialogues podcast is engineered by Diego Mendez, who is based in Vancouver. He edits these episodes together, making us look and sound super professional. And also, he uploads these episodes to wherever you listen or watch this podcast.